Right. PY is in the chat. I will try to take one from closing opposition. Opening government believes it is a travesty that we see a presidential race run between a 77-year-old and an 81-year-old, really sucking all the air out of the room and really not including anyone in the discourse. We think that past a certain age, you should stop being a politician, and because some people can't really take the hint, past this certain age, we're just going to stop you from being a politician and kick you out. What is upper age limit is going to be, we can let states decide. But I think realistically, it's probably going to be between the age of 60 to 65. This is when most politicians retire, and this is also when most politicians should retire, the open government believes. After you hit the age limit, we will strongly encourage you to retire, and if you don't, we'll just kick you out. I want to forward three arguments in this speech. The first is to explain why older people are generally associated with wealth, influence, and power, and why it's harder and harder to hold them accountable. The second, I want to talk about morality and conservatism and why these older politicians are less open to change. And lastly, I want to talk about how they're less likely to engage with the youth voter, a very important demographic in our democracy. Let's first talk about wealth, influence, and power. We will argue that the older you get, the more time you have to accumulate wealth, power, and capital. Like business leaders, they have built empires, they build connections, they have a lot of fame, for example. People like Trump or Michael Bloomberg or Mitt Romney, or whether you are a very well-respected community leader, they have done a lot for the community. And the older you get, the more that you have done, the more people respect you, the more connections you have built. It also happens that if you come from a technical field, like if you're a doctor, like Dr. Mahathir, you're more experienced, you have more skills in the field that you are in, you're respected as an expert, as an elder. And that's why the older you are, the more likely you are to be powerful, the harder it is for you to hold you in check. Why is this damaging? Because when they choose to consolidate power and to use it for their own ends, for example, when Mahathir silencing the critics of people like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore that lock up dissidents and quelling protests, it is harder for you to hold those people in check because of the power that they have, because of the influence that they wield, because just how many people like them and how many people are benefiting from having a positive relationship with them. So if you're the opposition party in Malaysia when Mahathir was just silencing everyone, people didn't want to be associated with you because they stood more to gain by being associated with the ruling party rather than standing up for justice and equality. That's why those accountability mechanisms tend to work a lot less. But secondly, also when these people just don't necessarily know better, like in Bangladesh, where the premier just basically imposed quota or Mao Zedong back in the Great Leap Forward, where he didn't want to listen to experts and told all the farmers to melt down their farming tools to presumably seize the means of production. These are people that people tend not to want to criticize, people tend not to want to disagree with, and that's why the decisions that they make may not necessarily be in the best interest of everyone. And I also don't know that this incentive is just pretty clear, like the older you are, the more power you tend to get, and just evidenced by all of the negative things we've seen our leaders done over in the past, shows that people tend to accumulate power, and those that have power tend to use it for their own selfish interests, which often does not align with the needs of the many. On a comparative, when you have younger politicians, or at least when you have an age cap on these politicians, they don't have the same amount of time to accumulate power and influence, which means that they don't have it's not as bad. And so when they do things that are not necessarily the best, you can kind of criticize them, you can call them out, and it's much more likely to hold them in check. But secondly, I think also you kind of change the incentives of politicians. So it's no longer about accruing as much power as possible because in the status quo, they can stick around for another 10 to 20 years. It is much more likely that they will focus on their principles and their values because they want to focus on leaving a legacy. And they're also going to want to focus on stretching and transferring their power to the next generation. That's much better in terms of democracy. I'll take CEO before I go on.
Yeah, so older politicians, because of fears of entrenched bureaucracy, fears of cognitive decline, oftentimes have more scrutiny than younger politicians, which means it is more difficult for them to actively use their gained power to their own advantage.
So one, I don't know why that's true, but secondly, even if there's more scrutiny, these older politicians have more power, they have more influence. So they have business connections, they have established connections with local leaders. That's why these leaders don't want to jeopardize those connections. Business don't want to jeopardize subsidies or whatever they're giving them. And that's why they're less likely to call them out in many cases to often decry those people who are criticizing the state, and therefore these changes don't happen. Okay, second argument. Why do we older politicians tend to be more conservative and less open to change? One, because the older a person gets, they have more life experience, they tend to be less open to new ideas, especially when those ideas are deeply indoctrinated. When you talk about religious values, social values, traditional values, and stuff like that. This is very damaging for progressive voices that are seeking change, like the LGBT movement, like racial equity movement, like climate change movement, because the older generations don't necessarily think that queer relationships are normal. The older generation may have some regressive views about the role of racial minorities in our society, like immigrants, for example, where the climate change is actually happening not in the first place. But even if that's not the case, the older politicians tend to have a voter base that is older and more conservative that they need to cater to get to their values in order to get the support. This looks like the Republican Party consistently catering to the Catholic Church and what the evangelical voter base want. Because that is their source of power. So even if they want to change, and I do think that many politicians in the Republican Party kind of recognizing need for change, they're not able to do so because they're held hostage by their voter base. On a comparative, younger politicians are generally more liberal as social values that modernize over time, meaning it is much easier for the queer movement or any social movement to lobby them to get more support for change. And it's not just individual politicians that we're talking about here, especially if you want to change laws and you want to change legislation, you need to have the support of basically the entire parliament. And that's why this age limit is necessary to hasten and speed up the process of replacing politicians to have that political regeneration and to eventually create that degree of change in that legislative chamber to support this. Older people tend to be more conservative. Younger people are much more likely to be open to change and therefore pass those progressive change that we want to see. The last thing I want to talk about here is how older politicians tend to be disconnected from the youth and the needs of the younger generation. Older people, just because they are from a different generation, it becomes hard to relate to the needs of younger voters as our society and as our economy evolves. So past the COVID pandemic, we're really looking at things like job security, looking at things like affordable housing, and like it took Biden like forever to pass the Student Loan Forgiveness Act. All of these show that older generations tend to prioritize their own needs, like their healthcare needs, like retirement funds, etc., because it's easier for them to relate to. Even if that's not the case, even if some of these older people did want to reach out to younger voters, we will argue that the youth voters and these youth movements are less likely to want to engage with these older people in the first place, especially if they see the older generation as the source of a lot of their problems. So on a comparative, it's much more likely for you to see that engagement, to see leaders care about the needs of the youth. And the youth are particularly important as a demographic, one, because they have a lot of political capital and energy, two, because they're going to become the next emerging market and going to become the next working class. So a lot more engagement with the youth and the future of tomorrow is much more likely to lead to a politically engaged youth, to have them included in democracy and more representative voice overall. Yeah, all people are terrible. We should stop them from holding so much power.
Thank you so much, colleague and leader of opposition.
Okay, cool. Just checking that I'm audible.
Yep, you're audible.
Great, thank you. And we'll start in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition believes that we should not be small-minded enough in this debate to blame the structural flaws of the American Electoral College on the entire demographic of old people. To scapegoat this demographic as the result of these flaws is to work backwards against what democracy stands for. It's to fall apart and it's to stand for apparent things. I want to give 3 main responses in my speech, and then I'll move on to explaining our case and our arguments. So firstly, the opposition opens, and the government opens with the idea that all people lack accountability and checks and balances within these spaces, and thus they just ought to be kicked out entirely. A couple of responses here. Firstly, these characteristics that they paint as giving people power, such as wealth and personal influence, they never explain how they're going to be inherent to age. Often, in fact, we think they're inherent to other things, like the personal influence comes from cults of personality, such as Georgia Maloney, and I think she's rather young, she's like 40 years old, has built up. Or the wealth doesn't often come from like your personal pocket, but it comes from the PAC funding of like powerful people who stand behind your cause. These things are never exclusive to age, and thus their line of trying to ban people to get rid of them was never going to work in the first place. Secondly, we think there's significant media attention on people as they grow older because of the scrutiny and the rhetoric that the government tries to win on. Thus, we can probably hold them accountable better than other people. But thirdly, we think just because we can't entirely control what people do and we don't have entire says on like the decisions that they make because they're slightly too powerful, never means that we ought to ban them from the system entirely. We think that's the wrong solution and it's far too extreme. They can never win on their principle. The other two lines I want to talk about quickly. So firstly, they say that they're going to be, like, old people will be focused on leaving a legacy more and making better decisions because they know that they only have a limited time in the space. Two responses here. Firstly, often it still takes really long to build your way up into the party and to gain enough influence in order to be in a position of leadership. This isn't going to change on their side, so presumably they just like have very, very little time to enact anything at all. I think that takes away their benefit almost entirely. But secondly, even even if they are able to get there, what that actually means is that they're going to be pushing policies too fast and too extreme because they know that they're going to be kicked out soon, and so they want to like make their mark. They want to accomplish what they came to do before they leave. When importantly, when you push policies too fast, that's when they tend to fail. When you ramp them up too extremely without making sure you have widespread support, that's when everything falls apart. If anything, the policies and the decisions these people make get worse on government, not better. The third thing they bring up quite quickly then is the idea that old people aren't in touch with the youth and they make too conservative decisions, and a lot of rhetoric along that line. Two responses here. Firstly, we think people don't directly represent people or vote on the idea of just physical demographics. Think about how Trump in America, a very, very massive portion of his voter base is Black Americans who have been economically disenfranchised because they believe that he is able to save them from their plight. People don't vote on physical characteristics, they vote on the values that they believe politicians have. So they're unable to solve their problem of not having enough representation on youth, if that is going to be their logic. But secondly, we think there are many checks in place to make sure that the people are getting what they want, no matter who's in power. Look at how all the laws have to pass through the parliament or the Senate or the House, whatever equivalent exists in that country. Look at how everyone has a vote, and most countries have like direct representation and like people who represent you within those decision-making spaces. So if it is true that conservative decisions are still being passed, then I think at least a significant portion of the country still wants those conservative decisions to be passed. Then we may condemn that with our liberal debater logic, but we can't argue against it with the principles of democracy. It has to stand if that's what the people want. The case of the government is rhetoric and it's flawed and it's not going to stand in this debate. Let's move on to ours because that is the winning one. So firstly, what is our stance? We're fine to stand or to use our fear to rather an opening opposition, to instead implement mental and physical checks on people's capabilities before they're allowed to enter or like continue being in the political space, and then ban them from running if they fail those. So if you have dementia, you obviously can't make decisions, then we have to kick you out, unfortunately. These standards can be decided by like parliament and medical professionals. It's not important what specifically they are, but what is important is that we don't implement a sweeping policy that says that all old people can't enter the space. Just like if you're severely incapable, then then you can't enter it. So 3 arguments about our bench. Let's start with the first one. We think principally it is just quite abhorrent in order to ban these people for 3 reasons. Number one, you take away the people's right to choose anyone to represent them that has been so hard fought for, that people have died and given their lives for. That is the very foundational principle that democracy is built on. Opening government would throw it away. Secondly, we think you push policies of discrimination and generalization because you, exactly like opening government did, pick 1 or 2 politicians who are bad, you blame it on their age, and then instead you don't just kick them out, but you would like to blame it on their entire demographic. I think that is the foundation of discrimination. That's something that has no place in a democracy where everybody is supposed to be equal and supposed to have a voice. But thirdly, we think people have the right to see yourself in government, to see somebody that looks like you, and that even if they're not representing your interests, that you feel like they could represent your interests. In the same way that young people or people of color deserve to see people of color in like positions of leadership, we think old people ought to have the ability to see other old people sitting in positions of leadership. That is a right. That's what it means to be part of a democracy. On all 3 of these principles, that democracy is fundamentally based on, opening government and the government bench as a whole would throw them away. When they throw away what democracies are based on, they can never try to win a debate on democracy. Secondly, though, we think, second argument, these people are rather useful and efficient to have in the political space, whereas on the proposition, they would make them retire entirely when they hit the age and kick them out completely. So we think they're beneficial in 2 ways. Firstly, through the experience and connections that you're able to have, either just from like living a long time or from your like long time specifically in the political space. This is important because often it consists of difficult, delicate situations that you need that experience to handle properly. But secondly, we think it means that you're able to have at least some continuity of leadership. Because understand, on both sides of the house, it takes a long time to get to the top in politics. You know, to work your way through, to gain people's trust, all of those kinds of things. But on their side, as soon as you get there at like 50 or 60 55 or 60, then you suddenly have to leave again. So it keeps changing. We think that like values of the party continue changing, and there's lots of power struggles every few years that tend to like tear the party apart when you like continue, when you have that like continual changing. We think this argument goes to show that even if these politicians aren't all good, the benefits that they bring are foundational to the function of democracy, and thus we ought to keep them. The final argument that I want to touch on quickly is that we think you set an incredibly harmful precedent on the side of government for excluding people based on physical characteristics, because you have to implement this policy with laws, and laws set precedents that you have to follow for future decisions. We think there's open space for things like we have to like banning people of color or banning women because you don't think that they're good enough to represent people. You don't think that they're good enough. When you set precedents, that's when everything starts to fall apart. And when you vote for government, that's when democracy starts to fall apart. So proud to oppose.
Thank you so much, Honorable Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi. Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. I'll start on my first word. Panel, the median age of people in America is 39 years old, but the median age of a politician or someone in Senate is 65 years old. Nancy Pelosi, for goodness sake, is 83 years old. The Pope is 87 years old, and we all know what he has a reputation for. The premise of opening government is that time allows you to accumulate more structural influence, more power and connections that younger people often find hard to fight against. To that extent, I don't think we see a proper response from opening opposition, aside from the fact that they say, I think old people need representation for some reason. Let's talk about the precedence in status quo, which is that we already exclude people based on certain characteristics. Like if you're a criminal and you're objectively like bad, like people don't allow you to run. So I don't understand why age can't be a factor as well. Like Mitch McConnell has frozen up multiple times in the middle of his speeches. Like if I do that now, I'll look really bad, right? Like these people heavily rely on flashcards, their memories are going. Like Biden literally called his Vice President Trump a few days ago, if you follow memes like I do. No thank you. I'm gonna discuss two things in this speech. Number one, are older politicians better? Secondly, I'll talk to you about political discussions and how it gets hampered. And I think this deals a lot with the opening, with the opposition material. Let's start with one. Why are older politicians better? I'm going to first deal with the continuity argument that comes from at the end of the speech before me. They say that there will be power struggles every few years. On the contrary, we disagree. We say at the point in which you know that you have a limit that you will now leave the office, there is more incentive, no thank you, for people to institute structures to peacefully hand over power to their successors. This looks like the Democrat and Republican parties handing down to their successors. So I don't think there'll be a power struggle per se when people know that, they're like, it's the similar argument. If you know the end of your life is near, you'll get your affairs in order instead of, panicking and doing all sorts of random things. But let me extend this by talking about physical limitations, which is something very intuitive, right? Like quite intuitively, as you get older, like your age takes a toll on you. Like you're very statistically likely to have a disease. If it's not heart disease or obesity, you know what the rates in America are like. There's also things like, dementia, which comes for everyone at different paces. Like there is statistical evidence to show that older judges, no thank you, take longer to process sophisticated legal arguments. In their Supreme and Federal Court judgments, they're more likely to copy and paste complete phrases from parties' briefs instead of coming up and enunciating their own decision. Why is slower mental faculties necessarily a harm? This looks like the overturning of Roe and Wade, which gave women the constitutional right to abortion, because judges are not able to properly grapple with the situation of people on the ground. Number two, let's talk about them saying that people don't vote on physical characteristics. No, thank you. We agree, like cults of personality do exist, but the delta in this debate is about age, right? Like all of these cults of personality and wealth and all exist under your side. You also have to contend with that. Our argument is that the older you are, the richer you are and more connections you accrue. And they try to rebut this, but I logically I don't think it works. Like the thing about wealth and money is that over time it tends to compound. Like Warren Buffett was worth 1 million at age 50 or whatever, now he's worth like billions at the age 80, 90, right? Like that's a very simple argument to prove that over time your money tends to compound. A younger politician who does not have a cult of personality or similar monetary like status as you is unable to fight. Number 3, let's talk about them saying that we take away the people's right to choose in democracies. The first thing I want to point out is this is empirically false. Like most people want to discredit Biden, like Democrats want to remove him from the presidential running. If you do polls on Mitch McConnell, all these older senates, right, like overwhelmingly like 2/3 or 70% of people on the ground genuinely are in favor of a maximum age of 65, 67 for politicians. Like, so I think it's very untrue for them to say that older people need representation when the situation on the ground is that people do want a genuine change. No, thank you. Like, there are so many more electable candidates in the Democrat and the Republican Party. Like, what I'm not sure why like they elected like Biden and Trump, right? Like, we'd argue it's because they have a long time to accumulate influence. It's really hard to call them out. So the bottom line of everything I've saying so far is that we need someone who is more sensitive to the needs of people on the ground, someone more orientated with them in terms of political ideology and age, and not someone in ivory tower who has had time to enjoy his position at the top. Number 2, let's talk about hampering political discussions. I think this takes out a lot of the ops arguments. I think they say a few things. Number 1, I think CO POIs and says there's more scrutiny on older politicians, and OO also says that wealth and influence are not exclusive to age. There are 2 harms we want to talk about in OG. One is that these people, politicians who are older, are often able to leverage on nationalistic sentiments in a bit. So they're able to say things like, I led the country to independence and that is why you must vote for me. That's why the example we gave of Tun Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia or Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore was particularly important because political parties and their successors are able to leverage on this fact to clamp down on opposition. They will say, wait, you don't agree with the impediments of the country? Are you anti-nationalistic? Are you not grateful for us? Like the ANC was able to leverage on Nelson Mandela leading people out of doing all the good things he did, and people often find it really hard to fight against these structures, right? The reason it's bad is because we gave you a lot of reasons in first why, like, structurally and ideologically their ideologies are likely to be different. So people simply cannot fight against these nationalistic structures. Yes, I'll take one, whoever that is.
Would you ban rich people from politics?
Maybe, maybe not. I don't suppose it's that important. Like, the delta is age. It cannot be wealth or anything else because it also happens under your side. Okay, that's 6. Let's talk about the feeling of nostalgia, and I think this really deals with Ops case. Number 1, we think if you allow older politicians to run, people often come to the ballot box and vote not based on merit, but based on nostalgia. Why is this important? Politicians like Trump are able to weaponize this feeling of nostalgia. He can say things like, oh, in the good old days, things were like that. People are likely to vote on this. He can say things like, let's make America great again. The problem with this narrative is that people who believe in the good old days are often likely to believe racist, sexist, bigoted things, right? They're often likely to believe things like, oh, people are snowflakes and they're too easily offended. They're often likely to believe that women are oppressing men, and equality is not about, equality, but about putting women higher than men and discriminating against men. So on a scale, yes, there's still mudslinging of the harms that Ops talk about still happen on their side, but it is harder to engage in rational discussions when they can leverage on the feeling of nostalgia that most people aren't even conscious exists. The bottom line of the OG is that these people are often in control of extremely important things like the weapons, nuclear codes, laws which govern the country, taxes, spending, fiscal policy. All of these things are incredibly important at the point in which people can't properly deal with and negotiate and resort to feelings of nostalgia. That is the world we don't want to live in an OG.
Thank you so much, Colonel Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Cool. I'm just confirming if I'm audible and visible.
Yep.
Cool. I just need like 2 seconds to sort out my notes. Cool. I'll take all POIs in the chat, please. Probably one from closing. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think opening government loses on just one simple flaw, and that is the fact that they don't actually point out to why any of these issues are mutually exclusive to old people. Because they have a problem with rich people being unaccountable, so why wouldn't they just ban every single rich person if that exists? They have a problem with people not being mentally fit, and we think that we solve this problem by having certain issues in this place. But note that the biggest problem that they actually have with old people is that they are conservative, but note that there are still 50% of the American population, which they claim is, like 39, and, like that's their average. But they are still voting for the Republican Party, even though they are so much younger. Note that this is proving that young people have the same equal capacity to be buying into conservative values. But I'd also just like to point out, because the entire argument is just based on this weird debater intuition that liberal equals good and conservative is, like the bane of society that's trying to bring back like segregation. But note that conservativeness doesn't necessarily just mean badness. It just means that, one, you're likely to support things such as a more free market, for example, or two, you want stricter laws on immigration. We oppose certain things like having bigoted views, but note that this isn't just responsible. We think that one of the biggest driving forces between anti-LGBTQ like language and anti-drag rhetoric in America is Ron DeSantis, a 40-year-old living in Florida. Note that I've just proven to you in the beginning of my speech that there's no mutual exclusivity to any of the harms that they bring to old people, thus this policy is illegitimate to implement. Note what we rather said. We think that mental capacity is a problem, and we are fine to implement laws to have people have mental checks. But note, we think that it is up to the people to elect who they want to represent them and who they believe has the best ideologies and who is best going to choose this in order to do this. Cool. 3 things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to respond to each of their arguments. Then I'm going to weigh up my first speakers, and then I'm going to bring to you an extension about why it emboldens populism and distrust in the government. Cool. On accountability, they tell us that you have more wealth and thus you have more power to be held accountable. I've already told you this is not exclusive. We think that there are very rich people that get born in privilege, they get born with silver spoons in their mouth because, their parents were previous members of politicians. We think that this necessarily just means that you are unaccountable whether you're rich or not. We think if they really want to ban like rich people, we think it's a bit extreme because we think that in most liberal democracies there are genuine streams. This debate doesn't just exist in America where the democracy is pretty much failing. It exists in Europe where majority of people are able to access things like good higher courts, good Supreme Courts, and good parliaments that can actually hold politicians accountable. But note, we also just think that this isn't necessarily true. We think that oftentimes in most countries, politicians aren't paid that well. So oftentimes career politicians that are extremely old and have been working in politics since the age of 20 and are now 70 often just don't have the same amount of money as new politicians entering that come from things such as big business. We think on their world, it's likely that big business politicians and very rich ones that they oppose in this debate are likely to enter because there's a short span that they can enter. So it's very difficult for people to then become career politicians and for people to actually want to invest a long time in seeing out the different goals of them, what is happening. Thus, we think that accountability in their best case is mutually exclusive, but we actually think that it's likely that they get less accountability for the same metric of people being able to get more wealth when the period of when you can be a politician is shortened. But secondly, they tell us that old people are less likely to be liberalized. They tell us liberal indoctrination and regressive views, but note at the same time that they're telling us that they use the liberal freedom movements that they fought for as a reason. So we think that this is inherently contradictory. But I'd just like to give you a crash course on what's actually happening with the ANC in South Africa, since they want to use that example, is that they're one of the only liberal parties that are still existing, and there are some of the most, and they're also some of the oldest politicians, meaning that the majority of young Black South Africans are still voting for the ANC because they see the views of, trying to fight for Black people's economic freedom and economic justice that was brought from apartheid that is being brought onto them. And these old people here are some of the people that are fighting the hardest from it because they've experienced the worst injustices from this. Note that this proves that old people have the capacity to be even better than young people in South Africa who contain a large conservative group of wanting to free up the market and end things such as affirmative action policies. But cool, we think that secondly, a more conservative voter base doesn't necessarily just mean that they're old people. We think that Americans have a conservative voter base and they're a bunch of young people. But even if you have a conservative voter base, this is a valid form of existing. We think if your people support your views, a part of democracy is that the majority of people can agree on what is best for society. And thus we go along with that in order to get the goals that the majority of people actually want so that the majority of people can live a better life within us. But thirdly, they tell us that they have no reasons to care for change. This is not true for 3 reasons. Firstly, We think that, rich people can also do the same thing. They just don't care for change, so not mutually exclusive. Secondly, we tell them that they've often been a part of this policy for a long time, so thus they actually care a lot more about political systems because they've devoted their entire life to it. But thirdly, we think that they have things like grandchildren, they have things like children that they actually care about leaving a future to. Thus, they generally just want to have good politics because of their long-term commitment to it, and they often aren't just a bunch of nihilist people that don't care about anything and just live in a complete vacuum. Cool. I'll take a POI from closing if they have one.
Would you be
Nothing.
willing to IQ scores?
Sorry, you can go.
Would you be willing to reveal the IQ scores of politicians based on your counter policy?
No, we just would say, like, if someone has Alzheimer's revealed by a psychiatrist, we think that they shouldn't be a politician because their brain literally is not able to function. That's not really a part of this debate. Cool. Then they tell us about how old people are disconnected and they can't relate to young people. Note how this can extend to young people. We think Vivek Rishwani, whatever his name is in America, doesn't necessarily care about what is actually happening to young people, and he's often having policies that just benefit very rich elites that is existing within here. But secondly, weaponizing that you have been in a freedom movement isn't necessarily something that's bad. It's about recognizing that you have fought for these people and they ought to recognize the sacrifices that you have made in society to do this. Cool. Now moving on to my extension about how I embolden populism. So firstly, as Laura has already mentioned to you, you're attacking many physical features. You're not actually explaining that it is the policies that are bad, but rather it's immutable characteristics. This is extremely harmful because it looks like extending this narrative onto things like an LGBTQ politician not actually caring about straight children just because of their physical characteristics and because of their mental characteristics. We think that this is something that's harmful in of itself. But secondly, they tell us that the gov is bad because of what the people in there look like and how old the people are versus the bad systems. This looks like the same narrative that poor opening government has believed in because these narratives exist in society. They are too short-sighted to think that it's the fault of electoral college and just the bad political systems that exist in America, but rather they just want to blame age. Panel, if you want to fix the issues of America, it's not just going to blame Biden for his age. You're going to blame the structural reasons that have allowed Biden to be there. We think that Bernie Sanders is a good politician and is one of the only socialist leaders in America. If people feel represented by it, it is illegitimate to strip people based on this choice and to discriminate unfairly against old people. Panel, is clear opening opposition ballot.
Thank you so much. Calling on member of government.
Hi, am I both audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay. She, her pronouns. I prefer verbal PIs, and if everyone's ready, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2. Judge, the problem of opening bench is simple. It's that their debate is simply just not relevant in the current world. Practically, you cannot ban the rich from running within a presidential debate over politicians. So what is the point of debating it? What is the point on debating whether old people care about the society or about younger generations? Like, obviously, to a certain extent, they are going to care. That's just not the crux of this debate. What matters then is the impact on the political system by old people running as candidates, and that's exactly going to be the metric in which we win this debate on. 2 clarifications before I go into anything. First, I want to attack the opening opposition counterfactual. The reason why OO cannot win this debate is simple. It's that they set a counterfactual and they don't debate on the comparative after and completely drop it in their second. By counterfactual, or by setting up a counterfactual of intellectual tests, they concede that a problem exists, that many of the politicians that we have in current world, especially the older, are often incompetent. On comparative then, the reason why their model of intellectual tests actually absolutely suck is because if you reveal that you are taking IQ tests actively or testing whether someone is intellectually competent or not, the standard debate, I'll take you a bit later, the standard in which you evaluate a politician now shifts towards the direction that you actively care about their intellectual capacity. So let's say that you don't reveal it. At least in there will be a lot more societal pressure to dictate people on whether you are smart enough. That's just another red herring for people to judge based on, rather than actual political ideas and ideologies that people have to offer. But also, it inherently favors smarter politicians based on arbitrary metrics. Like, what are you even going to test them on their IQ, on their EQ, on like the SAT? They never give you a clear model and as to why this is going to be effective, rather than simply, oh, we're just making sure that they don't have a mental This is literally the baseline for what we already have in society. Like, I'm sure Biden doesn't have dementia, but that doesn't mean that he's entirely capable intellectually. The reason why then OG is irrelevant in this debate is because they don't give the very simple response that I just did and continues on with their criminally unstrategic case on why old people are simply not competent, even when OO tries to respond to that. Second response on the accountability issue. I also don't think that this is as largely relevant, but just to give you a few responses, Diallo tries to come up here and tell you that sometimes new politicians have more money and therefore they can flip this. Hello, I'm South Korean. It is untrue that younger new politicians are able to take over older ones. Our president is literally 63 years old. He came up to the presidential debate with like a religious drawing on his hand. Clearly, he does not have the same intellectual capacity that they claim that they have. But even if it's true that the metric changes to money, we are far more willing to concede that money is a better metric, even if we need to defend the rich. Because at least if I'm the largest owner of the company that is like the basis of our country, I have a far more direct influence on the country. So it doesn't matter as much if I'm the leader compared to when I'm just old and I have no relevance on the impact I can give society in general. The discourse then in their world centers around age, which is why even if you are old, young people simply don't vote because they lack credibility within the presidential system itself. Before I get to my extensions though, I'll take a POI.
Don't let them straw man us, panel. We said it can just be a psychiatry test just to make sure that they don't have like something like dementia, which doesn't exist necessarily in society. But the actual problem is they do not explain to us why the problem in society is with an old person with a religious drawing on their hand. Would they have the same problem with a young person?
Judge, if they're simply saying that, oh, we're just making sure they don't have dementia, they don't claim the benefits that they claim in terms of the intellectual capacity, easy as that. Two extensions. Firstly, on why does age-centric power change in our world, but secondly, on why this course is far better. On the first extension, OG correctly identifies that it's a problem that age-centric power exists, but they don't explain to you what the difference is between a 60-year-old and a 70-year-old. The reason why the focus shifts is simple. In opposition, company lobbying and connections are going to be not evenly distributed because companies will necessarily hedge their benefits on the fact that these politicians are likely to be long-term, with the ability of longevity, that it's a long-term investment that you have. So even if this politician is really dumb, or even if they don't have good policies, at least for a long time, they're more likely to represent you if you lobby into them. In our world, the recognition is that there is no guarantee that this politician is going to have a long-lived career in the first place because we place an age band. That means that the way in which companies lobby or try to invest and place their support is going to be rather more based on the ability for this politician to make actually good policies or the ability for them to be popular. We are far more likely to care then on their ability to gain traction. We think that's far more effective. But also, per second, we prefer the wealth and independent, factors independent of age, like opening opposition gives you, is going to be the metric. So sure, maybe in our world, people are rich or you have independently privileged backgrounds, at least that relates with your ability. For instance, if you own a large company, that simply means that you are furthermore able to have more representation or at least power over the nation. We think that is far more relevant of a standard than whatever other arbitrary metric you can give in terms of age. The way here is simple, that without this mechanism on why the focus of power changes, perhaps the main harm that we prevent cannot actualize. Our second extension then is why we have a better quality of discourse. And here's where OG loses, because they never explain to you that the difference is not in the ability of the old people, but the impact that they have within the political discourse. Two independent mechanisms then. Firstly, on why we gain better effective discourse. Age is simply just a large red herring. The 2 minutes of the presidential debate of the arguably most powerful country in the world was based on who had the better ability to do both. We don't want to spend time on jobs instead of competing. We don't want to spend time on explaining on who is less young or who is more physically competent. Obviously, even if age doesn't have as large of an impact on their capacity, that is what people care about, and we don't want that to be the focus of the literal presidential debate. But also, secondly, on why younger people are far more likely to engage and run and have political discourse in our world. The idea itself that the market is very saturated towards the old right now is what actively prevents younger politicians, because there are ways for older politicians to shut them down. For instance, by not winning the primaries because the older politicians already have so much power, or being actively shut down in terms of the campaigns that they have because people are far more likely to recognize the older politicians. That simply means that in their world, younger politicians are actively disincentivized from running, from the point at which we actively cut them out, we create more opportunities. But also, even so, simply in terms of these social narratives, the younger you are, the more likely you are sensitive to woke culture. That means that we are able to cancel you far more easily, especially if you're a young politician. So sure, maybe it doesn't have to do with liberal or conservative conservative ideas, but the premise is that at least in our world, we have far less blatant xenophobia and blatant racism because we can call out that far more easily when youth actually care about in politics. In their world, you have a general disincentive to care about politics as the youth in general because you already believe that you are underrepresented, which is why youth voter rates are so low in the majority of countries that we talk about within the current status quo. The weighing is simple, that we disprove all misconception that this debate is about ability. It's about the impact it has on the youth, and from the point at which we better engage the youth, we are far more likely to have better political quality. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much. Calling on member of opposition.
One sec. Okay. Give me just a sec to get organized and then start my speech. Oh, great. Sorry, I'm gonna deal with the timer on the fridge behind me. All right, there. No more annoying beeping throughout my speech. Okay. Okay. Opening government tells you that older politicians are worse than younger politicians and thus should be banned from politics. Closing opposition is going to explain how older politicians are actually often better to have in politics, which notably beats opening government off the bat because as they aren't running any sort of principled argumentation and closing government as well, since they also base their entire case off of the damages of having these politicians in the political arena. Insofar as closing opposition can prove that it is actively positive to have them in the political arena, we're winning on that front, meaning that we're clearly beating both of those teams. So why do you get better politicians on our side of the house? Let's talk about opening government's case first and then jump into closing government's case. Opening government broadly argues that that older politicians tend towards being wealthier politicians and tend towards being worse politicians with worse agendas, etc. Let's talk about wealthier first. The only warrant that opening government gives for this is that older politicians have the time to build up wealth. I think this has been dealt with very thoroughly, but the political landscape is a specifically unique landscape where you don't actually need time to build up wealth insofar as the funding powers that exist out there are big fans of you. Notably, politicians make a lot less money from their actual what they're paid over time than they do from donations, etc. Wealth doesn't come from being a long-term politician. It comes from having a lot of people propping you up behind the scenes. The issue here is that I'm unsure as to why older politicians are more likely to be in favor with the people who actively fund politicians, so it's unlikely that they are necessarily going to be wealthier. Some of them, yes, that may be true, but there is no comparative on our side of the house. You still have massively wealthy politicians who are entrenched in the political system way too much. They don't get any change there. Second, they argue that you get worse politicians. Their arguments for this are as follows. First, that older politicians have deeply entrenched ideals. I think most politicians have deeply entrenched ideals. I'm unsure as to why older politicians have worse deeply entrenched ideals to begin with and why that is necessarily going to be negatively affecting their policy. Second, they argue that older politicians are irrational because they're old and at the end of their lives. I think this is incredibly unlikely to begin with because most people in the political landscape aren't going to act irrationally whatsoever. There are just barriers in place that make it so that they can't do that. But notably, older politicians are likely focused on setting up a legacy. This doesn't look like irrationality. It looks like conviction to pass the policies that you want, to pass the agenda that you have, because you're nearing the end of your life and you want to set up a positive legacy that will be viewed positively by your constituents and those around you going forward, because you want to leave that mark on the political system in a positive way. Most old politicians don't want to be seen horribly after they die or out of politics. Most of them are going to push for positive things there. Thirdly, they argue that older politicians can leverage their legacy to constantly get into office. Note here their warrant is Lee Kuan Yew, who honestly, if that's who we're defending being in office for the longest period of time, very, very happy to take on that burden. Yes, Lee Kuan Yew leveraged his legacy. He had a legacy because he was a very good politician who was incredibly beneficial for the state that he ran. point with legacies is that you have done positive things in the past. Older politicians can access that because they've had longer, but that doesn't mean they're worse. It just means that like the ones who did better succeed in the longer term. Closing government broadly argues that like you get better discourse on their side of the house. They say that like this focus, the focus shifts to who is the younger of the candidates. I think like their warrant here is a product of Trump himself, not a product of old politicians. We've had plenty of old presidents before. There have been plenty of old politicians and old political debates that don't center around whether or not I'm the younger candidate. That was a product of a specific thing and has very little to actually do with age and a lot more to do with the rhetoric that was being weaponized. But second, like they say that the comparative is that people pay more attention to blatant xenophobia and racism. I'm just entirely unsure as to how that enters the political landscape. Note that people have higher like safeguards on older politicians because they're seen as more likely to be like xenophobic or racist because like they are older, which means that they pay more attention to that when it's actually in the discourse when you're dealing with older politicians, when older politicians are in power. I think the change there is unlikely to begin with, not comparative and like pretty minimal. Okay, I'll take CG's POI.
So under your world, what would old politicians then try to fight for then?
Being like good political actors. Let's talk about why older politicians tend to be better in the first place. The first argument here is just that they have significantly more experience. This looks like political discipline, where older politicians have less political naivete, where like they actually know how the ins and out of their systems work, which means that they can pass policies significantly more efficiently. This is especially important in the context of like the United States, where the Supreme Court just issued a ruling forcing politicians to write literally immediately legalizable policy instead of letting it be fixed after the fact. Only older politicians who know the ins and out of the legal system are going to have access to that. Second, they're better able to push through bureaucratic red tape significantly faster, just because they know how this system works. They know how to take advantage of it and move their policy actually through, which means you get more effective and more like efficient policy on our side of the house. Second, on more experience, they understand their constituents better. Two reasons. First, because they've represented them for longer, which means they've received backlash probably at certain points and like gotten a more central idea of what their constituents actually want. Note that many politicians generally live within the areas they represent, which means that over time you get a better understanding of those communities just naturally. That means that you get better representation on our side of the house when there are some older politicians who are let into the political landscape. Second argument, that they have better access to networking. The longer you are in politics, the more connections you have access to. This means being able to make like agreements at a higher scale, being able to again pass policy because you have those connections. You just get more efficient and more effective policy on our side of the house. Third, because they have that legacy agenda that I fronted at the start of this speech. And fourth, because you have to cater to a younger voter base. Let's turn opening government's argument. They say that older politicians only care about old people. No, this isn't true. That's where the vote is most guaranteed for older politicians because they identify with them the most. That means they have to cater to a younger voter base. If that younger voter base is more liberal, as OG never like actually proves, then you get better representation full scale from older politicians. The final thing here is that you have a more diverse political landscape on our side of the house just because you haven't banned certain people from politics, which means better, more diverse like discourse, etc. Finally, let's position ourselves against opening opposition. Opening opposition tells you that we shouldn't ban people because of age, because this is principally wrong, because people should have the right to represent themselves however they want. The issue with opening opposition's case are as follows. First, they stab themselves in the foot by counterpropping banning based on mental ability. Second, they don't prove why people should have the ability to choose whoever they want when it comes to a utilitarian cost. They just assert it. And third, they make this argument in a landscape where people are barred from running based on age already, i.e. 29-year-olds and younger are barred from like the US presidentials. For all those reasons, very proud to win from CG.
Thank you so much, calling on government whip.
Yep. Just gonna organize my notes. Then let's start. Okay, I'll take POIs verbally, and my speech starts in. Sorry, just give me a sec. Speech starts in 3, 2, 1. So the main repudiation coming from opposition, both open and closing, is that old people aren't so bad. So what we should note is that, number one, they don't address the ongoing lack of youth discourse that we keep on telling you again and again. And secondly, they still don't address how the current system they engender of the elderly generation centric society is somehow something good. And they try to paint this as something positive. However, our side clearly recognizes the ongoing harms of having doddering politicians who don't recognize or is able to actually relate to youth and the problems that currently affect us, and how we actually prevent such ongoing societal harms from continuing to happen. So I'm going to address the teams in the following order. First of all, opening opposition. Secondly, opening government. And lastly, closing opposition. So moving on directly to opening opposition, right? Two things. First of all, we believe that they have extreme faith in the current existing system and also the mechanism they bring to the table. Because first of all, they just say the only mechanism they really have is for their counter policy, we have increased checks in place, right? So two things, right? First of all, yeah, you say that, oh, right, we have a lot of people in the Senate, they have the parliament, whatever. The reason why that this works for you is because the parliament and Senate are also filled with old people. Have you ever seen a Senate or a parliament? They're just a bunch of old women and old men filling the same room. So what happens is their values are often aligned with one another. And this gives a false sense of affirmation. So whenever you elect an old politician and they come up with a new policy that is somehow going to be beneficial for the entire society, and then you bring that up to the parliament or Senate, they're all just old. So they obviously can relate to the issue far more than the overall population had. Still, the lack of representation still exists under your world. Secondly, no matter what, this still doesn't solve the problem, the lack of youth engagement discourse. And I know that opposition, both open and closing, try to paint this as something that's not really necessary, something that's just a little side benefit that we don't really need to worry about. Let us mention again that youth also comprise society's future, no matter how cringe that saying is. And we also elderly population, the reason why they exist is to kind of pass on the said experiences that make them so much better and be able to actually revitalize the youth and help them and encourage them to lead current society. That's also the role they're supposed to fulfill. Now, also another thing, just a quick side note under intellect and physical checks, whatever. First of all, I think that if it is true that what you're saying about this elderly-centric society being good or whatnot, we still think that even if you try to use IQ systems and you lack complete transparency about it, there is still a high likelihood that the checks and balances that you claim will exist won't be able to occur because you already have corruption and bribery in the system. It's already quite rampant. So why do you think that somehow under your side, having these intellectual and physical checks will somehow make everything better? We don't understand a specific mechanism. And secondly, lastly, again, there's just simply, they don't address how there's a lack of representation of values at all. So we think that we'll just leave it at that. So moving on directly to opening government, right? So we do think that they hit very clear points on how influence and power are mainly concentrated in the elderly. So it's very, very hard for the youth politicians as underdogs to actually be able to gain representation or even to gain funding in the first place, because these old people are taking up these niches within society. They're taking up these roles, so they're unable to actually be within the public sphere. And we also think, so we do agree with that point. However, what do we do different, right? So the main thing that they do talk about is their mechanism is mostly just constitutes a lot of insults towards old boomers, which we believe is valid. However, that's not a clear mechanism, right? So we give you a more apparent mechanism because we think that even though the opening just says, oh, more youth equals better values equals greater good, they still don't address why increased checks and balances, according to opening opposition would make any sort of difference. They only say old bad, young good. However, for our side, we actually address why we actually have better, more inclusive social narratives and discourse. We give you these two practical benefits due to our two parts of our extension. First of all, we remove an elder-centric society, which is the main issue that we want to hit on. We're not here to talk about whether the old people are bad or young people are good. We're not going to pigeonhole them into certain specific roles or stereotypes. But what we do want is that regardless of conservative or liberal sides, we are able to actually reduce the volume of extreme racism, xenophobia, because of cancel culture, because it's a feature of youth culture that opposition cannot deny, that we have actual social mobility through BLM, through all such movements that are manifesting as a result of youth actually recognizing that there's greater need for change in the wider sphere of things. So before I move on to CO, I'll take a POI if there are any.
We win on our principle because if Bernie Sanders has the mental capacity, cares about the working class, and is the only social representative in America, it is nothing but a generalization and age-based discrimination that he is a bad candidate and should be barred.
Sorry, I didn't get the first half of your POI. My computer was muted. Could you just repeat it again?
We win on our principle because if Bernie Sanders has the mental capacity, cares about the working class, and is the only socialist representative in America, it is nothing but an age-based generalization and discrimination on his physical features as to why he's an illegitimate political candidate.
First of all, just on a factual side, Bernie Sanders is also being lampooned for being extremely out of touch and trying to be woke. So I don't really know what you're going toward there. By the way, that's also an example of populism, which your side also claims is something that doesn't happen on your side. So regardless of that, we think that overall, what you're truly missing here is Bernie Sanders is an anomaly. We do recognize that you keep on going about, Trump is like the anomaly, Trump is like the radical side of things. You guys are also bringing in very radical examples. Bernie Sanders is just one man. You still have, again, Nancy Pelosi, you still have Donald Trump, you still have all of these extreme range of like politicians just go on about like issues that they absolutely know nothing about and try to fix this world when they don't like have any concern about the youth population itself. What we have is we have actual youth discourse. We have thousands of Bernie Sanders who are actually young. So we are able to bring both the benefit of youth discourse and also stop old politicians from trying to pander to youth when we know they'll just discard them whenever they win the presidency. So moving on directly to opposing opposition, right? While we have time. So first of all, let's just talk about the alternative world, right? So what does it look like? So when we ask like, oh, so how does your world like become any different? They just say, old people would become good political actors. So we think that first of all, that's a very non-existent counterfactual, right? Because they blame our side for claiming old people are incompetent just because they're old and hence that we don't bring any change. However, they have the hypocrisy to claim just because old people are old and have experience, then they will somehow be better political actors. So they're actually giving us any criterion for how that looks like, right? However, we do bring you actual criterion on like how will it be able to like actually support better youth discourse, better youth engagement, better representation, and how we actually are the ones who can prevent a bipartisan system as these youth coalitions have like wider social issues they care about. They want to appeal to this youth population, so they're less likely to fit into these entrenched stereotypical kind of like political parties or like specific kind of norms of thinking. Because again, they're young, even though they may not have experience, which again is something that people should be teaching them on how to do, they are able to like kind of think outside of the box and actually try to appeal to younger populations and appeal to like other niches that may not have been represented or actually are underrepresented in the status quo. So again, a CO member just sounds like they would support like men dominating society because patriarchy exists. Because what they're doing right now is because essentially what they're claiming, oh yeah, is like elderly people like are currently ruling the world, so they're hence better suited. So we believe that this in itself isn't the change that we want. We believe that we're the ones who are actually able to bring you to discourse and actually lead to dialogue, and hence we're very proud to propose.
Thank you so much. Now calling on opposition.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep, it can be heard.
Perfect. I'll begin momentarily. And I'll also take POIs via chat. Okay. Which of these worlds actually creates a better world for the voter and for democracy itself? What we are seeing in today's debate is this debate that's like trying to make a lot of government has been trying to say that there's going to be these broad changes after this is enacted that actually makes ginormous differences in the political landscape. However, we want to say that like the change in this debate is incredibly minimal in the way that like banning older politicians does not actually stimulate any like additional discourse in the way that they want it to. They say that younger voices are going to be heard better, and they're also going to create like a better they're going to be able to be represented in a better fashion. However, this is not something that is actually going to be reworked into the entire political system as itself across the world, as we see that like the difference between, or sorry, if there are like all these like 80 and 6-year-olds being removed. Instead, we just limit the amount of people that are actually going to be seen as politicians. What this does is only say, like, this entire principle that they're trying to show us, or the burden that they have to prove, is that subtraction of voices is good for government, especially of the age group of people who are 60 and older. We see that this is problematic starting from the OG. OG tells you that there's like this entire problem based in power and wealth accumulation, and saying that they're old people are selfish, and that they're like damaging to democracy. However, what we want to look at are like these specific points in which, one, you're just like this entire case is just upset with capitalism intersecting with politics. We see that like all of these issues are not really based in like it being a problem of age, but instead being based in the fact that like money is involved with people's like constituencies. However, we don't even see like that even being the problem with old people when we see that like Sunak is still going to be as conservative, running the same conservative points that Boris did. We're seeing that Jeffries is still holding the same democratic or like liberal values that Pelosi did. All of these people can still purvey all of their beliefs into their party, into the young people, just by like grooming them in their political ideology. None of this is solved underneath just banning old people outright. We're still going to see people making these ideologies come through the younger populations. Just because they're old people doesn't mean that these are bad values. Instead, we're looking at the values of themselves that need to be weighed in today's debate. And that's not really what's going to be solved at all throughout this resolution or this motion. Moving on, we also see that like this entire point that is brought in by the government bench that by reducing these voices, we actually create a better world for younger people. However, that is not going to be solved, especially when we see that there is a less diversity of voices in the market of politics. We see this especially when people like voices like Bernie and voices like Cornel West have been giving like great ideas to younger voters who had no exposure to like socialism, especially when that is especially important when they're like giving some kind of experience into a complete political ideology that's demonized in the country. We don't see those voices actually being harmful. Instead, they're giving more breadth to different perspectives, something that is completely lost if we take away these older voices just because of their age and their physical characteristics. Additionally, we see that like Josiah brings a great point in the fact that all these people have actual better experience in getting those different political ideologies further in the political sphere. The only reason why we even see socialism being like actually pushed slightly like in the subtle policies in America is because someone like Bernie is actually able to navigate the political systems of the United States to actually make these policies sound like palatable, or at least put them on a level that they're actually going to be seen that otherwise would not be able to be like persuasive to younger voters or older voters. This is something that is completely lost in this entire into all of these speeches that try to say that these experiences are bad because they're simply always going to be conservative. They're always going to be like selfish, and instead don't look to like the actual problems that they are outlining perfectly, that this is all going to be like in capital. If you want to fix the problems of like wealth accumulation or like wealth being in politics, you're going to solve that by like putting like wealth caps onto like political donations, or making sure that people aren't able to like have insider trading. Like a lot of those issues are solved elsewhere. This is a band-aid solution that's only going to like exacerbate the issues we see in our democracy, when all of these older people are just going to be hiding their like ideologies behind a smiling like young face. Like that does not change anything in the political sphere. Additionally, what we see as like harmful in like all of CG's case is they talk about like how we just need more youth representation, and like that they're not getting the funding that they're needing just because old people are taking up their funding. If I remember correctly, a lot of the parties that are on the global sphere and the political sphere are still getting the same funding by larger groups. I mean, you see that like someone like AOC still got a lot of funding and a lot of votes and representation, even though their constituencies are still older in like New York. And a lot of those people are going to be of like different like beliefs. I'll accept OG.
All right. So the experience and connections that you claim is a benefit also grants older politicians an unprecedented amount of power. Without the proper accountability mechanism, they have strong incentives to weaponize it for their own interests in all the examples we've shown in this debate. Accountability is not solved under our policy, but is significantly improved, and that's a worthy trade-off for better policies for the country.
Again, not necessarily just because of your experience, you're going to exploit some kind of power. Just because you know how to use it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to, like, especially when you're at older age. I mean, there's less likely that you're going to be in politics just because you're going to die at some point. The fact that, like, again, like Josiah says, the legacy that they're trying to purvey is going to go into younger generations still. So, like, we don't think that this power is just going to be vertical in a way that it only stays within the one politician, but instead it goes horizontally for the entire political, the entire political ideology itself, with like the work that Democrats do for older Democrats still goes on to younger Democrats, or like a lot of the Labor Party is still getting the benefits that older people did that goes on to the younger generations. They are not going to be taking away actual powers from younger people, but instead it's going to be just like actual work being done onto their political side. We don't see that age is the problem here. Instead, we see it's the fact that like Gov is misplacing all of these problems onto old people. Instead, you need to be looking at like the actual problems that are like, if you're like the entire Gov side has been arguing that like conservatives are just bad and like everyone else is better than them, then if that's the debate that we're having, then we're completely missing the point on what the point of the age limit is. And that is not to actually make it easier for people to have like their representation in government. It is instead there to weaponize it against them. And with that, we can see that like a lot of younger voters are still getting the democratic representation they are, even with older people. If the problems that we're seeing are coming from anywhere, it's from capital, not from their age. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for a wonderful debate. You may now cross the house. Please do not leave this Zoom call. We'll just transfer to another room to deliberate. But after that, we'll come back here to deliver our oral adjudication. To the judges, let's proceed to deliberation room.